Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, pleasure to be here.
So you got your latest book, Psychonauts, out now. What are you exploring in the book, and what made you want to write it?
Yeah, it's kind of territory that I've been writing about for quite a while. I kind of fell into writing about the history of drugs um, quite early on when I was a journalist and covering drug stuff back in the 90s. And then I kind of grew up, I guess, like everybody else, assuming that drugs had kind of suddenly appeared in the 1960s and they
Hmm.
hadn't really existed before that. And slowly it dawned on me that actually what we now call drugs is a whole bunch of different substances with very different histories that come from very different parts of the world and very different cultures. And I got kind of fascinated in because we all know basically, what drugs do. I just got interested in the people who were the first people to try them, who had no idea what was going to happen, and what did they make of them, and how does that compare to how they are with us now? And then how did they get there? How did they find their way out into the culture? How did they become this thing that they are now? So that's something I've been writing about for a long time, and in various different formats. My book before Psychonauts was called Mescaline, and that was just taking one compound and tracking that all the way through from its indigenous ancient roots through into that kind of period in the Wild West when it became part of the Plains Indian ritual and crossed over there into Western science, and that was like a really fascinating moment. So I thought what I'd really like to do was to drill down a bit deeper into that moment, to write a book that was focused on that period at the end of the 19th century, which was also this great period of discovering the mind. It was when uh, psychology as a discipline first got going, and people started to figure out, that there was an unconscious mind, and became curious about how that worked. And you started to get all this kind of avant-garde art and modernism, exploring all that. And so I wanted to write a book specifically kind of focusing on that period. And one of the things that's so different about that period, which makes it so rich and interesting for me, is that if you were a doctor or a scientist, or indeed, a writer or a philosopher, and you were interested in studying these mind-altering drugs, it was pretty standard practice to start off by taking the drug yourself and then describing the effects of it. And that's so different from now, when everything happens kind of by one remove. It's all brain scans, this, and neurochemistry, that. So this seemed like a whole other way of approaching the science of drugs that people had kind of forgotten about. So yeah, that was why I wanted to write a book that was focused on that period and focused really around this practice of self-experiment with mind-altering drugs.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear some of those accounts from because you're right, that really doesn't exist much anymore, where you have people who are studying the thing, trying the thing through their own experience. But like those stories are so interesting, like Huxley's book, and then Alan Watts wrote about it, and then you talk about William James. Like there's all these people, but it doesn't seem like we have that very much anymore. And in tracing the history for this book, it seems like there's a lot of different directions you could go in. How did you navigate what stories to focus on?
I guess what I did, first of all, was I to sort of put together all these self-experimental accounts, which I've been doing for a long time, and saw how they shaped out and what people were interested in, and what mind-altering drugs meant at that time, what were their potentials as well as their dangers, which we kind of hear much more about that. One of the things that seemed to fascinate people was the idea that, this kind of, that they might kind of give us cognitive powers that we don't normally have. They might make us sharper and more intelligent and expand our minds. And then there was another strand, which was about the limits of consciousness, which really gets going in the 19th century when people discover what will eventually turn out to be anesthetics. But then they realized that there were drugs that you could take, and you would kind of lose all sense of your body, but stay conscious and be in this kind of twilight world, this kind of different dimension. And people were really fascinated by that. So that was another section. And then quite a lot of stuff clustered around the creative imagination and the way that drugs can give you a bigger kind of subjective space to explore, and that those kind of explorations, can be what we would now call recreational, but they can also be creative or artistic, or they can also engage with spiritual and magical and occult practices.
Mhm. So what were often the approaches with some of these substances? Was a lot of it just kind of whatever, let's just kind of see what happens? Was it pretty open-ended, or were people wanting to find or experiment with specific things? Like how planned out was it in the beginning when people started to mess around with these?
Right. I think generally people didn't mess around with it unless they had a good reason. With there were only a couple of things, like nitrous oxide briefly became a kind of mass recreational thing. But
Yeah.
by and large, you didn't, it wasn't a culture where everybody was taking everything they could find just to see what it did. It
Mhm.
was people found their way for particular reasons. Quite often people found their way through psychiatry and interest in abnormal mental states, for example. Other people found their way through pharmacology and trying to develop a new drug. So mostly the people that I've written about in this book anyway, who were taking drugs, were taking them for a particular reason. They weren't kind of just interested in drugs per se. They got to a point where they thought it might be interesting for their work. It might kind of take them further. And a lot of it was very professional. And there was quite a professional cachet attached to it. I mean, somebody like Humphrey Davy, for example, who was the first person to inhale nitrous oxide, that was really the making of him. His career was taking insane amounts of nitrous oxide and describing the experience. And he's referred to all the way through the 19th century as a great scientific hero. He became a great hero of popular science. And it was like, wow, this guy cares so much about science that he'll subject himself to this. He'll so it was kind of like, if you weren't self-experimenting, you weren't doing it properly, you were a bit of a dilettante. So in some contexts, you find, taking drugs is a mark of seriousness, a mark that you're going to go that extra mile and you're going to really put yourself into your experiment.
Yeah, which is funny because it seems like it's kind of the opposite now.
Yeah, that's right. And it's there's a bit of a sort of stigma the other way, that if
Mhm.
you're kind of studying the psychedelic science and you're writing about your own psychedelic experiences, that makes you a dilettante, and you should really just be paying attention to the data. Yeah.
Yeah. How much of that has to do with placing so much value on randomized control trials? I think that started in the 60s.
Yeah, it did. It started in 1962. That was the sort of FDA amendment that got randomized control trials going, and uh, controls against placebos. And I think that really changed the landscape. I think you're right to pick that as the moment where we got to where we are today. Although it was a part of a trend that had been going on for a bit longer than that. But once you've got randomized controlled trials, you're not really looking for individual subjective experiences. You're
Yeah.
just looking for the biggest possible cohort. And you're trying to prove that, this drug has the same effect or as similar as possible across the widest possible range of people. That's what makes it, in FDA terms, a safe and effective drug. And I think that's been one of the problems with psychedelic research recently, that psychedelics are not safe and effective by those terms. People have very different experiences, and you can't average them out. And you kind of, and there's no real space now, I think, for individual responses or subjective accounts like that within the science. Although I think there is kind of on the outside of the science. I think that's
Mhm.
why people like Michael Pollan have been so incredibly popular. Is sure, people are interested in knowing about 5-HT2A receptors and the use of psilocybin in therapy, but people really want to know what's it like,
Yeah.
and I think the people who answer that question, are the people who become the sort of figureheads for this today.
Yeah, it's a seems like a pretty stark contrast between the interests of the researchers and the interests of the general public, especially with psychedelics. I mean, it's a completely different focus of those two groups. Like as far as I know, like the general population, nobody's really worried about the impact on receptors.
Yeah,
But
yeah. But I think that's sort of, I mean, to go back to sort of Humphrey Davy, who sort of starts this with his nitrous oxide research, his big book on nitrous oxide, the book that makes his name, it starts off with the chemical synthesis, and then he goes on to talk about animal experiments and all the work he's done on how much of the gas is absorbed into the bloodstream and so on. And then he ends with, these subjective accounts from his friends who included, like romantic poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And before he gave them all a airbag of gas, then he said, okay, the condition is that you write a little description of this. And so that was kind of the way he did it, was to put these two things together, the chemistry and the pharmacology on the one hand and the subjective experience on the other. And I think you get a really precise echo of that more recently when you read Alexander Shulgin's work, like Pikal and Tikal, the guy who, synthesized, MDMA and then like dozens of other phenethylamines and tryptamines and produced these two big door-stopping volumes. And he does the same thing. He's his reports on each drug start off with the synthesis, and then they have, okay, this is what it felt like at 70 milligrams, and this is what it felt like at 100 milligrams. And Shulgin was a great, he was a principled self-experimenter. And I think the reason that he was different was because he wasn't trying to make any money out of this. He wasn't trying to patent his compounds. He wasn't trying to get them licensed. He was operating in his lab independently, outside of any institution. He could do what he wanted. And so he said, self-experiment is part of the process. If I just produce this white powder in my lab, I haven't really figured out what it is. There's no way just from the molecular structure to tell whether it's going to be psychoactive or not. I have to take it before I get to know it. So I think, that principle is still there, but I think you just can't operate that way these days if you're, trying to be, part of the academy or part of the pharmaceutical industry.
yeah, it seems like that freedom to not worry about making money off of it is so important for like coming up with some of the more innovative ideas in the space.
Mm-hmm.
Just willingness to just freely experiment and just kind of see what happens. How much of a social, because it seems like there is social pressure, especially with philosophers and researchers, like there is kind of a weird kind of social game that can happen where it gets kind of competitive and there's awards and how many citations, and like how much of that pressure existed back in the 19th century when people first started experimenting.
Well, much, much less, because universities were much less of a thing. They existed, and some of the people, like William James, for example, was a professor at Harvard. But a lot of the leading figures in science and pharmacology and the discoverers of these drugs were working independently on their own, and there wasn't the same kind of academic pressure to publish and build a career. So and there were gentlemen scientists who had their own laboratories. We're talking men, particularly in science, because science was composed pretty much entirely of men at that point. And a lot of it was also doctors who were very, very good in those days, much more than now, I think, at describing. They took a great pride in their ability to describe mental and physical effects of illness or drugs, because this was the days before there were like tick box diagnoses,
Yeah.
and so if you didn't know what was going on, you had to be very, very good at, okay, the patient is coughing. What kind of cough is it? And you would have like about, 50 different words for different types of cough, so it's people like that who are really, really interested in symptoms and effects, who are, often the people who give the best descriptions of, what we'd now call trip reports.
Yeah. People who kind of weren't confined by a standardized way of describing things, which has its value, but there is something that like you when you can't rely on that, you have to get a little bit more creative.
Yeah, from the very beginning, there was kind of a protocol, and we still remember how that protocol goes, because it's like, okay, 10:30 p.m. took, 60 milligrams of this, waited, 11:15 p.m. started to notice the first visual tracing, blah, blah,
Yeah.
so people were always trying to do that, in the Western tradition, and in Western science, people were always trying to be very precise about describing what the drug was actually doing. So, and often, for psychoactive drugs, that was kind of the way everybody proceeded anyway. So there was that kind of protocol, but there was always this tension. On the one hand, you want to kind of get as much objective data as you can out there because it's useful to people. So you want to kind of describe very carefully, how do I feel that's different from how I would feel if I hadn't taken this drug? But on the other hand, there comes a point where you have to put yourself into it and you have to narrate in the first person and say, this is how I felt and this is what I saw. So the objective and the subjective are always in tension with each other. And I think it's not like there's a right way of doing it. It's like everybody who was investigating this, found a different balance.
Mhm. What was it about nitrous oxide that made it so popular back then? It seems like that's kind of drifted away now.
Yeah, it's kind of hugely popular here in Great Britain now. I think
Oh, okay.
it's the second most popular recreational
Oh,
drug
wow.
after cannabis here, which is like insane.
Wow.
Compared to where it was. But that's so much of that is about this thing of the whipped cream canisters and the balloons, and it's become so super easy, and you can buy it all on Amazon and everything.
Right.
But I think nitrous oxide was amazing to the people who discovered it. Humphrey Davy and Thomas Beddoes, the doctor he was working with, who was researching the medical use of gases, and these romantic poets who were his friends, Robert Southey and Samuel Coleridge, because it kind of, you got this immediate effect, this great sort of surge of euphoria and a bit of pins and needles and tingling. And then usually just as you were coming back to consciousness, this feeling of an amazing revelation, you just had this big cosmic wow. And how could this be? I mean, this was, as far as anybody knew, a substance that didn't exist in nature. It had just been discovered in the laboratory. So how could it be that it had this incredibly powerful effect on the mind? Because this is the time when a lot of people thought that the higher functions of the mind, the imagination and the spiritual sense, were kind of something to do with God and not really to do with the body.
Mhm.
So it was really fascinating conceptually, but it's very hard to find a medical application for it. And the first application that people found for it was as popular entertainment. I guess a bit like the kind of stage hypnotism shows we have today. You'd have somebody coming on stage with a big tank of gas and they'd give a little lecture about how this is going to, do this or do that or have incredible effects, and call for volunteers from the audience, and people would come up and huff some gas and then act out some crazy thing. And, and it became enormously popular in sort of music halls and variety shows, and then particularly in the States in carnivals. It was just like the perfect thing for a carnival, because you were going a new place every night where nobody had seen this, so you could wow people every night. And that was actually how it found its medical application, because one night there was a guy there who was a dentist, and he saw people stumbling around on it and whacking their shin really hard on a bench and seeming not to feel it. And he thought, I could do with that in my dentistry practice. That would be a whole lot more popular. So strangely, then it became, the great modern medical discovery, and particularly the great first triumph of American medicine. It's still celebrated every year in Boston, Ether Day. It was ether that was used for the first experiment. But that was only after, decades of people just kind of fooling around with it recreationally that the medical application emerged.
Yeah. Does nitrous oxide have is it susceptible to changes in set and setting like some of the other drugs are?
I think much less. I think the nitrous oxide and ether and then chloroform with the three kind of volatile inhalants that became popular, that became anesthetics and were widely used in medicine, but they were all discovered by self-experiment, and they all produced this similar kind of effect where you felt the real world fading away, and you felt yourself being kind of hugged away, maybe leaving your body, having this kind of out of body experience, or maybe you were visiting the astral plane if you were like spiritually inclined. So in that sense, I think it didn't have, the set and setting kind of faded away to the background.
Yeah.
And then people had these experiences, and doctors noticed that if you gave they just collected accounts of, giving somebody ether or chloroform, in bed at home because they were in pain. And then they'd say, oh, suddenly I was up on the ceiling, doctor, and I was looking down and seeing my body from a distance. And, so these effects they were the kind of thing that, people had always talked about, in a slightly mystical kind of way. But now, hey, you just had like a bottle and you could do it experimentally whenever you wanted, so it brought a lot of things that would have been thought of as spiritual experiences. Suddenly there was a whole choice of different ways to interpret it. You could do it pretty much on demand, and what is this? Is this just a weird glitch in the brain as it's shutting down, or is this another whole subliminal part of the mind that we don't normally have access to, or am I connecting to some other dimension? And it's very like the conversation we have these days about DMT and entities, and is that another dimension? And there's a lot of that kind of conversation went on in the late 19th century along very similar lines.
Yeah, so it's similar in that way that the set and setting almost, in some sense, becomes irrelevant because like you feel like you're in a different place.
That's right. But the idea of set and setting was kind of really well established at the time, particularly with the use of cannabis, which was usually hashish, taken in what we would regard now as crazy heroic doses, maybe 2 or 3 grams eaten orally. This is smoking cannabis didn't come in until till the late 19th century, 20th century. So for a lot of this period, people would take large doses of hashish, and you get people saying, way back in sort of 1850, you want to be really careful with the set and setting. You want to put yourself in a really nice situation, and then you'll have this kind of great Arabian Nights trip, But if you're doing it in the wrong place, you'll get really paranoid and it'll be nightmarish.
Yeah.
So that was with other substances that was very clearly established early on.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the differences between how edible hash affects you versus smoked marijuana?
Right. It's I guess it's more somatic. You feel it in the body more. You also have when you smoke it, you're titrating the dose, right? You have a couple of puffs, and 5 minutes later,
Right.
you see how you go, and you maybe have another couple of puffs. This was much, much more like a trip, in the sense that, like a psychedelic trip, in the sense that you swallow something, you don't feel anything for an hour, maybe more, and then you suddenly start to feel this thing kind of coming on, sort of from your stomach radiating out. And then the kind of doses they were taking, you're kind of polaxed. You can't really move or speak
Oh, wow.
for several hours, and you've got these constant hallucinations kind of chasing around your mind. And people had observed this and thought, oh, it must be a sedative, it must knock you out. But then when people self-experimented and started taking it themselves, they went, it's the opposite. I've just got so much going around in my head, I can't hold on to one sentence, for long enough to speak it. And then people started trying to, dictate or describe or remember, these long sequences of hallucinations.
Yeah. And they took careful precautions because of how powerful they can be and some of the risks for psychosis. Does that seem to be like more of a set and setting issue? Or like how much of that is rooted in set and setting, and like how much biology do you think?
Yeah, it's you get, I think people understand, a lot of people had very strange and quite psychotic experiences, but the thing that fascinated them about it was that you never quite forgot that you'd taken a drug, that it was kind of there was a French psychiatrist called Moreau de Tours who took it a lot, and he described it as a état mixte, a mixed state. He said there's one part of you that is totally tripping and hallucinating, but there's like another part of you that's kind of hovering back there going, hang on, this is that drug I've just taken.
Okay.
So I think in that sense it's not a psychotic experience because you retain insight into what's going on. But particularly in what were the European colonies where it was used, places like India and what's now Bangladesh and Egypt, there were always reports of people taking hashish and going crazy, and British doctors reported back that, oh, this causes psychosis, but that seemed to happen in kind of a small number of cases, and it was also really hard to judge whether the people who were behaving psychotically kind of knew they were and were going to be normal again the next day or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, why do you think that it seems like it's been, I guess, left out of the modern psychedelic research? Well, why do you think that is?
That's a really good question. It's, yeah, I mean, we have these kind of, it's very tightly policed. It's like what counts as a psychedelic and what
Right.
doesn't, is
Yeah.
salvia, is ketamine, but psychedelic was a word that obviously we didn't have until Huxley and Humphrey Osmond came up with it in the 1950s, and they always used it to describe a type of experience, and that type of experience is was produced by hashish in the 19th century. Charles Baudelaire, the French poet who described it, kind of said it's got three stages. There's this coming up stage where you start to feel kind of weird and giggly, and then the hallucinations start to take hold, and then this kind of real peak intense phase where you're totally lost in it, and then afterwards there's this phase that he called kiff, this kind of relaxation where like the storm has passed and you're just kind of sitting there and totally tranquil, and like you've got this 1,000-yard stare. That's kind of very like the way that people talk about psychedelic experiences these days.
Yeah.
So I guess the reason it's not part of psychedelic studies these days is I don't know. Cannabis has its own kind of role that emerged like slightly earlier, in medicine. So there's the whole medical discourse around cannabis, and not so much of one about kind of the sort of altered states of consciousness and the spirituality. But I think so much of the studies that are being done now on, with psilocybin or MDMA, you could do similar with hashish. I guess it's larger doses. It's a little bit messier. Physiologically, there's much more going on. There's something about psychedelics that kind of target those receptors, obviously very precisely, and makes them easier to study. Whereas people who are kind
Yeah.
of like have taken huge amounts of cannabis orally, it's like, what do you study first? There's so much physiological stuff going on as well.
Yeah, that does seem to be one of the concerns with these, is how many different things they're impacting at once, when we want so badly to have like one isolated variable that we can adjust very specifically. Well, what do you
Yeah.
think about some of the it seems like there's talk about modulating things like psilocybin a little bit to take out some of the effects and try to specifically point to certain receptors. Like, what do you think about adjusting them to try to like kind of make new drugs to study, in a sense? Like,
Well,
what do you think's getting lost? Like, do you think there's going to be a problem with that?
no, I mean, I think a lot of it is about people trying to find a new compound that they can patent and
Yeah.
license. I think that's a big problem for people who are trying to, come up with pharmacological and medical applications. These have all been around for ages. I think that kind of happened around Aldous Huxley time with mescaline and LSD. The reason that LSD became the sort of drug of choice rather than mescaline was because it's active at so much smaller doses. And whereas mescaline, the theory was, because you have to take like, 300-400 milligrams, the theory was this was just kind of like a poison that was washing through the brain and
Mm.
sort of disorientating everything. But with LSD at those microgram doses, it's like this has got to be flicking one particular switch. And I
Yeah.
think, it became more interesting for that reason, as well as, of course, much cheaper because a gram of mescaline is like 3 doses and a gram of LSD is like, thousands. And
Yeah.
that's why I think LSD kind of took off in the psychedelic counterculture as well. I mean, why would you make a gram of mescaline when you could make a gram of LSD? And something like mescaline has a lot of has a huge spectrum of effects. Because it's a phenethylamine, so unlike DMT and psilocybin and stuff, it's kind of adrenergic. It has a lot of physical responses. Quite a lot of nausea. A whole huge balance of things, and then you get like a lot of the compounds that Shulgin came up with, like 2CB, which is kind of, in a way that's kind of like mescaline tamed for the chemical generation. It's only like 3 or 4 hours instead of 12. There's
Mhm.
a bit of nausea, but not so much. It's not so, doesn't have the physical effects. But it's got the euphoria. So I think that kind of tweaking has been happening for 20 or 30 years in the recreational market. And in terms of the medical market, I think the real problem is that psychedelics go on way too long for those guys. That's sort of 5, 6, 8 hours. You've got to have highly qualified and highly paid medical professionals hanging around.
Yeah.
They would really much rather have something that you could just like switch on and switch off when you've had your hour of clinical time. So I think a lot of it is looking for something that is easier to manage and to fit into a 21st century clinical paradigm.
Yeah, it is wild how much more potent LSD seems to be than the other ones. And
Yeah.
but it's interesting that it was synthesized too. So like there seems to be that difference between like something being made in a lab versus something being grown like mescaline being in peyote or psilocybin being in the mushrooms.
Mhm.
Does that seem to be a trend that's across many of these drugs, like the potency and something that's made in a lab versus something that's taken or consumed from a plant?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, obviously, a lot of people are breeding plants in ways to increase potency, and that's probably been going on for a very long time. With something like peyote or San Pedro or Chuma, for example. There are some strains in some areas where the potency is a lot higher, and that probably represents certainly in the case of San Pedro, selection by humans over many hundreds, possibly thousands of years. And, there's always an attempt to, something like morphine, for example, which was the first alkaloid to be extracted, is much more potent than opium. And then, of course, diamorphine, heroin, way more potent than that. And then fentanyl, way more potent than that. So, with plant extracts, there's always kind of an attempt to get the substance as pure and as potent as possible.
Yeah. Could you touch on the Native American tradition a little bit with mescaline? I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating, not least because in terms of the use of peyote in the United States among the Plains tribes, it's relatively recent. It was used uh, in what's now Mexico for a very long time. And there are people, kind of indigenous people in Mexico, like the Huichol people, who still use it in much the same way that they used to before the Spanish. They hid out in the mountains and they
Hmm.
kept their old school cemetery sort of ceremonies and pilgrimages and stuff going. But among the Southern Plains tribes, the Apaches knew about it a bit because that was their territory. The Comanches knew about it a bit um, as a medicine, but it was only really with the uh, forced captivity on the reservations that it became part of a tradition for them. And that was the same time that the Texas Railroad got going, and there was a particular reservation in southern Oklahoma, which was the Comanche Apache Kiowa Reservation, where it seems that the what we think of now as the peyote ceremony, in the teepee at night round a fire, where that got going. And a lot of the reason for that, finding the form that it did, was that there were a lot of attempts to prohibit peyote on the reservations from the missionaries, the Protestant missionaries there, and also from the federal bureaus of the Indian government. They felt that this was kind of something that was backward, and you had to kind of stop the Indians doing it before they could become proper American citizens. So that's why it was kind of in a teepee at night. It was clandestine. It was hiding out. It was like maybe the communions the early Christians had in the Roman Empire or something. It had that underground thing.
Yeah.
And the other reason, I think, it took me a while to figure this out. I've had there's a Comanche group in Oklahoma called Sia, who are really awesome, whose lineage goes right back to Quanah Parker, who was the chief of the Comanches at that time and was more responsible than anybody else for spreading the peyote ceremony among the tribes. And of course, everybody who kind of approaches them is like, "Whoa, peyote, psychedelics, cool," and it's not. It take and they're kind of they take all that, but it takes a little time, before they will say, "Well, actually, the real reason we started was because they banned all our singing and dancing on the reservations, and we'd always done that, and that was so central to our culture. And getting into that group trance state, that was absolutely the center of our culture. And suddenly, when that was banned and we couldn't do that anymore, we had to find another way of doing that. So,
Wow.
they would kind of say, if the singing and dancing hadn't been banned, we probably wouldn't have adopted the peyote in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. How similar is that tradition to the ayahuasca tradition in Central and South America?
I think it's quite different in some ways. I mean, there are various different ayahuasca traditions in South America. The one that you might kind of compare it with is the Santo Daime, because that's also has kind of Christian elements. And I think the popularity of Santo Daime in the big cities like in Rio and Sao Paulo is that there are so many, millions of people living there who kind of know they're from the jungle. Their grandparents maybe came from there, and they're interested in their indigenous traditions, but most Catholic churches aren't interested in them, and it's like, no, you've got to give that up to be a good Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
But the Santo Daime is kind of like a church for people who have those roots, who want to have a kind of indigenous kind of psychedelically inflected form of Christianity. And it's very Christian, the Santo Daime. It's all very stand still and in front of an altar with Jesus and focus on the light and stuff. I think the peyote, the plains peyote meeting, which varies a little between the tribes, but it's quite similar. It kind of has some Christian elements, but they're more from the Protestant tradition that surrounded it. The period when it got going was the period after the ghost dance, which was incredibly tragic and brutal. And that was really a kind of spiritual movement of resistance against white America, and people like Quanah Parker, who kind of didn't, he kind of never had anything to do with that, and didn't want the Comanches to have anything to do with that, because you could see it was just going to hit this wall of armed resistance. And what was kind of interesting and so important to him about the peyote ceremony was that this was something that could coexist with Christianity. We can live this new life that we have. We're no longer warriors, we're traders, we're whatever we are, but we have this teepee that we can go to, and we can still recapture the old ways doing that. And it's kind of it's not at all sort of orgiastic. There's no singing and dancing around the fire, in that sense. There are hymns, there are songs, there are prayers. It's quite like a Protestant revival meeting in that respect. And also in the respect, I think that and this is where it's very different from the Catholic thing and from the Santo Daime thing, that it's very much about your own conscience. You're your own conscience. You're your own priest. There is no kind of priest or shaman in the Native American church. This is like, there are these sacred things like the drum and the rattle, but the roadman is always, very scrupulous about passing them around and letting everybody touch them to say, we're all doing this together. So in that sense, I think you could say it's got a little bit of that Protestant culture in it, just as the Santo Daime has a little bit of the Catholic culture.
Yeah, another one that people were very interested in exploring was cocaine. Could you explain what people found interesting about it and how they were using it and what they were getting from it? Like Freud, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Freud was kind of one of the first medical scientists to really kind of get on the bandwagon, and it was kind of at that time, which is like sort of 1880 or whatever. There were a lot of sedative drugs. There was opium, there was morphine, and there were these new things like chloral hydrate. There was a lot of stuff to slow you down and knock you out, but there was very little apart from coffee as a stimulant, or strong spirits if you needed them after an accident or something like that. So that space for a stimulant became particularly important because this was like the peak of the Industrial Revolution and people working really long hours and taking their time from the factory and the machine. And there was a lot of fatigue and overwork and what we'd now call burnout. This was a big medical problem. So Freud's idea was that, maybe there is, cocaine is going to give people more energy, and everybody needs kind of more brain power and energy and nervous energy to cope with modern life, and maybe this is the drug for that. And
Wow.
And it kind of was for a while. It was the great, pharmaceutical success story of the 1880s, and people were taking it in all kinds of different forms, often quite weak forms, pastils or lozenges. There was a coca wine, and there were various tonics, and so that was like, I'd compare that with sort of like the Red Bull or energy drink, or I mean, these things are totally part of our culture today, and cocaine was that briefly for people at some point, until people discovered that. I think one of the reasons that coffee is and caffeine have become so ubiquitous is after a certain point, you don't really want any more. You have 3 or 4 espressos, or you have 3 or 4 Red Bulls, and that's kind of enough. That you start to get horrible side effects and get really kind of tense and jangly. And but cocaine, you can kind of keep on taking more and kind of keep on feeling better and better. And this was just about the time when people were starting to use the hypodermic needle more. So people discovered you could take like insane amounts of cocaine and like not have to eat or sleep, and then you were like super bright and you could talk for hours on end, and it seemed to really expand your mental powers. And that was what fascinated Freud, I think. He thought, there's this bit of the mind that we always hear about how we're not using all of our brains.
Oh yeah.
This was kind of the idea that
like a limitless drug.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It was like the limitless drug. We can get smarter. There's whole, cognitive abilities that we're not even touching, and something like cocaine can give us access to new, parts of the mind and new types of energy that we couldn't get to before. And that was really his interest. And of course, it kind of crashed and burned when you started to get the first people who just took insane amounts of cocaine, usually injecting it, and within a 2 or 3 days had started to kind of spin out and hallucinate and have nervous breakdowns, and then still for a long time there was a lot of different branches of medicine had found it useful in different ways. I mean, it was people who were specializing in addiction, which was a new thing at that point, were like, whoa, this is really dangerous. But all the people who were selling the drug across the counter in the pharmacy and selling it to people for all kinds of reasons, as a euphoric, as a stimulant, the local anesthetic, of course, it was really miraculous for, things like eye surgery. There were, whole kind of huge swathes of the medical profession pushing it really hard, while others were going, this is terrible, we've got to ban it. And so I think maybe cocaine is the first example of that. We've had that drama so many times since with so many different drugs, but I think cocaine was kind of the first example.
Yeah. When did that become outlawed?
It it kind of started with a consumer campaign against it in the 1890s, when people started, you know, you had these patent medicines that didn't have their ingredients on them, and you'd buy them for whatever, a cough or a cold or diarrhea, or sort of feeling run down or anything like that. And the people who were making them figured like that the more opium and morphine and cocaine you put in them, the better people would feel. And so it started really with consumers going, whoa, all these drugs we're buying over the counter are full of insane amounts of these, narcotics and stimulants and wanting to close that down. And that was kind of addressed in the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, when they had to, label properly the ingredients and stuff. And by that time, it had kind of, like a lot of drugs, it had become a thing that, more kind of establishment figures were sort of not using so much. A bit like you have that a bit with tobacco today.
Yeah.
That it kind of moves down market. And cocaine was doing that, and then particularly in the States, it was starting to get attached to the black population of the southern states. So you got all these stories about it being involved in kind of crime and rape and psychosis, and so it had a sort of, as a lot of things did, drug narratives in particular, a very strong racial tinge to it as well. And that was about the time that Coca-Cola took the cocaine out of Coca-Cola, which had originally been, and it kind of still is, it was originally called like the temperance drink, because this was the period of temperance and moving up towards alcohol prohibition. And the thing about cocaine's original selling point was, people will go down the bar and get drunk, but this is for the smart guy. This is for somebody who wants kind of to boost their intelligence.
Yeah.
Coca-Cola, it was, it was kind of positioned itself upmarket. But then, by the sort of 1900s, cocaine's reputation was kind of sinking, and Coca-Cola decided it was better to take it out of their recipe.
How much was in there?
It was, I guess, like probably the equivalent of like half a line in a bottle. But then cocaine is less effective when you're when you're drinking it. The reason people snort it is you absorb it straight into the bloodstream. If it goes into the stomach, a whole lot of it gets broken down before it's active. So it's a much less efficient way of taking it.
Was that popular then? It seemed like you're talking about it was mostly oral.
Yeah, it was, and and some of those had large doses. There was a drug that Burroughs Wellcome put out, which was called Forced March, which is kind of great. It's these like white pills, which is a pretty good dose of cocaine and also caffeine from cola nut. And that was really popular. I mean, that was and that was strong enough to be like, if you'd finished your day shift and you were going on to a night shift somewhere else, you'd pop one of those to keep you going through the evening, that kind of thing. So I think a lot of their use was functional like that. It's always, I think, very hard to draw the line between what's medicinal and what's recreational. People say, "Oh, I need this for my nerves," or "I need a bit of a pick me up," and
Right.
is that a medical use? And we have that same
Yeah.
problem now with like it's so hard to try and draw the line with something like cannabis, between
Right.
medical and recreational. And increasingly with things like MDMA, kind of where the science has all pivoted towards like, oh, going out and getting high and having this, big kind of great pro-social experience is really good for you, and it's part of your wellness program,
Right. Yeah, but like it seems like you would rarely ever hear about that being talked about as having some kind of a medical purpose. But
No,
like,
that's right.
but I'm not advocating for that, but it is kind of funny that like it would probably boost in some sense like some of the senses of well-being and social connection that like would be prescribed in non-drug induced ways by
Oh,
psychologists.
That's right, and there have been a few papers recently, saying this and going back and looking at kind of the populations, the cohorts who were, raving with MDMA in the 90s and seeing how they're doing. And yeah, of course, as with psychedelic science generally today on the news is all positive, where
Right.
back in the 90s it was all, oh, your brain's going to look like a Swiss cheese, you're going to burn
Yeah.
out all your dopamine receptors, and now it's kind of turned around.
Yeah, and that was what was the thing that happened with the MDMA study where they accidentally used methamphetamine, and then
That's
they
right.
used that brain scan and then said it was MDMA, and that kind of like ruined the research for MDMA for a little while.
That's right. That was George Ricordo. That was 2003, I think 2002, three, and yeah, then they you know dosed up these monkeys with kind of what they said was MDMA, and they kind of all overheated and died and stuff. And then people went,
Wow.
well, hang on, there's like literally millions of humans doing this, every weekend, and nobody's dying. So what's going on? And they went back and had a look and went, oh, whoops, yeah, that was methamphetamine. And I think
Yeah.
that was kind of a point at which the tide turned, at which people realized, hang on, people are getting huge amounts of money out of NIDA and these federal agencies for anything that will just show how bad these drugs are, and the quality control is getting really poor. And then at
Yeah.
the same time, that was just when people were starting to fund research into the more positive aspects of psychedelics and therapy and so on.
Yeah. Well, one of the problems now, it's a huge concern with recreational drugs is them being laced, especially with fentanyl. How much of an issue was that tracing back 100 years? Like, could you have been more confident back then when they were taking that in the 19th century, early 20th century than they are now? Because right now it's a really sketchy time for any of those kinds of substances. It seems like if you're getting them off the street.
Yeah, I think the historical equivalent of where we are now would be alcohol prohibition in the 1920s, right? Where who knows what you're buying? You might be buying, methanol or denatured alcohol. Government agencies at some point were deliberately putting toxins in alcohol to kill
Wow,
people.
that's
That,
crazy.
so that's kind of where we are now. That's just like what you might call a harm maximization model. I think what you had in the 19th century was it was pretty hard to uh, establish doses of things, particularly things like cannabis, where there was no standard dose. I mean, in fact, that's still a challenge for cannabis-based medicine now, but, every different crop from different parts of the world, varied from year to year, how much it had potency it lost while it was being transported and all that kind of thing. But nobody was kind of deliberately adulterating it to make money. And once you could get measurements of things, this is why morphine took over from opium, because morphine you could dose super accurately, and opium was always like you never knew what you were getting, and your
Hmm.
sources were always variable. So that's why doctors started recommending those drugs in kind of pure doses. So
Yeah.
yeah, there was purity of drugs was a challenge, but it wasn't like people were trying to maximize their profits in an illegal market, because all these things were basically on sale over the counter in pharmacies.
Yeah. Do you think that there will be any kind of transition or movement towards legalizing some of the things that we typically would never think that would have been legalized just because of how dangerous it is for people getting it off the street?
Yeah, I mean, happening already with
Yeah.
cannabis, I guess.
Mhm.
Last
Which
kind
just
of
got legalized in my state in Ohio.
right. So great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, but in Colorado or California, you know exactly how much THC is in what you're buying, and you know what the THC CBD balance is,
Hmm.
and that level of information is kind of I think that's a big step change. I think people can see that once that level of information is available, then it makes the substances so much safer,
Yeah.
and it imposes kind of regulatory costs, but then you get that the benefit of traceability, that you can tell where everything's come from. So that's a system which is expensive to set up, and it's kind of onerous for government and businesses. but if you do it, its outcomes are clearly better. So I think that kind of choice is being faced in different ways in different jurisdictions all around the world. Do you stick with this kind of you know illicit market where there's just this huge gray area of kind of contamination and corruption, but at least you can stand on your soapbox and say drugs are bad and it's nothing to do with us?
Yeah.
Or do you kind of put your big boy pants on and go, right, let's set up a regulatory system, and like has happened in Canada and Uruguay, and is happening in various places in Europe. But that's a hard sell to governments these days, in these, because it's I think that's probably one of the reasons why the initiative to legally regulate psychedelic therapy in California just went down. Is bills are just being slashed left, right, and center for cost reasons. So I think getting that kind of system running is expensive and difficult, but I think it's demonstrably better. And I think it's there's no reason why it doesn't only work with cannabis. It could just as easily work with other substances as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see where that goes, along with the psychedelic research, with everything seeming to ramp up. It's going to be cool to follow. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, thanks a lot for coming on and for doing this. I'll have your website linked along with the book. Along with those, do you have anything that you want to mention before we wrap up?
No, that's great. It's a real pleasure, Jake. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah,
Really
thanks a lot.
enjoyed that chat. And yeah, I mean, there's my website and there's the book, and that's most of it. Yeah,
Awesome, cool.
great.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you.